Welcome to UO Today. I'm Steve Shankman, Director of the Oregon Humanities Center. Our guest is Michael Sorkin, the 2006-2007 O'Fallon Lecturer in Art and American Culture. Michael Sorkin is an architect and architectural critic whose work focuses on urban and green architecture. He earned his A.B. at the University of Chicago, an M.A. in English from Columbia, and a Master of Architecture from MIT. He's the director of the Graduate Urban Design Program at the City College of New York, and he is the principal of the Michael Sorkin Studio in New York City. He is the author of more than a dozen books, including Starting from Zero, Reconstructing Downtown New York, published in 2003. 5 new works, I believe, are forthcoming this year, including Indefensible Space and Project New Orleans. His O'Fallon Lecture is part of a year-long campus series entitled Memorials and Museums of Conflict and War. His appearance here at Oregon is sponsored by the Oregon Humanities Center, the School of Architecture and Allied Arts, and the Savage Endowment. His lecture will focus on the World Trade Center site and the controversy surrounding plans for a memorial there. It's great to have you here, and I appreciate your coming after you got off the plane.
Pleasure to be here.
Yeah. And I take it everything went smoothly in the air this time.
Here I am.
Yeah. Now, you've made it clear that you think that there was a serious flaws in the way the whole memorializing of September 11th happened. And you say in your book, Starting from Zero, quote, "The public process has been hijacked by a small cohort of self-interested mediocrities." Do you stand by that sentence, and do you want to talk about it?
I do stand by it.
Uh-huh.
A bit of background. I mean, I'm one of these people who believes firmly that nothing should have been built on this site.
Uh-huh.
I take this somewhat extreme position, although Rudy Giuliani took it at one point, and a lot of the family groups also take this position. It's now far too late for this kind of commemoration.
Can we just step back for a minute, because that's a very interesting notion. So what did you imagine? Just a vacant space to memorialize it in a sense?
I thought that the replacement of precisely the architectural program that had been on the site beforehand, which is to say 10 million square feet of commercial space, was completely inappropriate.
Uh-huh.
I thought that the magnitude of the event demanded something more grave. And I also thought that the appropriate riposte to terror is an excess of democracy. This obviously affected my feelings about the process, which was very undemocratic. But it's also true, I think, that the way in which democracy reproduces itself as a spatial matter is in spaces of assembly and gathering. So I wanted to see that space dedicated to a great civic environment. You know, in the early days of the conversation about Reconstruction, very quickly the conversation turned to the notion that those tall buildings had to be replaced with other tall buildings. And some of the arguments made a little bit of sense. The one, I guess, that was most telling was that in terms of the iconography of New York City, you know, our most indelible symbols are those skyscrapers. And the logic of building a skyscraper as a symbol of the resurgence and recovery of New York made a certain amount of sense. But I argued that there are other symbols of New York, and I think that the preeminent symbol of the civic quality of New York is not a skyscraper, but Central Park, one of the great gathering spaces in the world, a place where many publics can come together and express themselves freely. So my notion of what should have happened on that site was not Central Park, but some kind of civic gathering space dedicated to free speech and public use.
And how seriously was that debated?
In the initial days, the notion was broached by any number of people, but it was almost immediately taken off the table. I mean, it was a relentless determination on the part of the authorities and the leaseholder.
I see.
You know, the legal and financial convolutions of this deal are probably well known to you, but they were determined to replace exactly what was there, and that was pretty much fixed in stone from day one.
So what about this small cohort? How did that happen? You say it's been a very undemocratic process. Do you want to go over, because I would say, especially out here in the West, you're living in New York,
Yeah.
and so you're closer to it. But I would think most people watching this show are probably not that intimately
Yeah.
informed
Well,
as to exactly what happened and where we are today.
And before we went on the air, we were chatting a little bit about the great Robert Moses,
Yes.
who may be known to many of your viewers.
I'm not sure. I mean, people in New York know him because
Robert Moses was the legendary master builder who was, in effect, the most powerful man in New York from the late 30s right up until about 1960. And one of the things that he pioneered was a structure of public authorities that essentially sat outside the normal democratic processes of review. People know about the Port Authority of New York. That was not his authority, that was the first of these great, somehow extra democratic organizations, empowered to condemn land and issue bonds to escape the normal review processes of city planning, unanswerable to the citizenship, in essence. And he was, the great pioneer, the master builder, got a lot of things done, on tens of thousands of housing units, bridges, parks, but outside of the normal means of public review. So the site on which the World Trade Center sat was owned by the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, which is one of these agencies that essentially is unanswerable. And just a few weeks before the attack, they signed a 99-year lease for the World Trade Center site with a commercial developer. So that was the legal situation. And these contracts somehow seem to figure more prominently and to be of greater consequence to the people in a position to make decisions than public sentiment. And indeed, the entire process was structured to give the appearance of democracy. There were giant meetings in which the public was listened to, but with no consequences. There was no statutory power vested in the public. So they listened to the public and then did what they intended to do all along, which was to replace exactly what had been there, which is what they will do.
And this is the group that own the people that own the land, own the property, or lease the property.
Well, the Larry Silverstein.
Yeah.
Let us name the name.
Yes.
Is the 99-year leaseholder.
Right.
And he has been charged with reconstructing the site. Of course, he was obstreperous. There were shenanigans, lawsuits. He's famously difficult, and in fact, a part of the site has been taken away from him. A series of complicated deals.
And he's angry about that?
No, he's
I
fine.
see.
He's making billions. But the Port Authority has, in effect, taken over the construction of the so-called Freedom Tower, which is apparently under construction now.
Right. So give me a sense of, give our audience a sense as well of the scenario, how this unfolded in broad strokes, and to where we got today, to where we are today, and what people can expect to go up there exactly.
Well, I think that within the last weeks it's become pretty clear what will go up, assuming that the real estate market in New York continues to cook. There will be one extremely tall building, 3 very tall buildings. One of the smaller buildings on the site, in fact, is the height of the Empire State Building without its mast. There will be a gigantic underground shopping mall connecting them. There will be a train station, which will be a rather beautiful building. And there will be the memorial, which itself, of course, has been controversial. You may know that in the last year, the budget for this memorial, the simple voided spaces, rose to $1 billion, which people thought, they sort of got out of the head of spare no expense into the notion that this was too extravagant for this memorial. Now it's been refined, value engineered, pared back a bit, and it's down to $500 million.
I see. And give us an idea of what this memorial is.
The memorial, well, one of the things I'll talk about tonight is the way in which the notion of a sacred iconography emerged on the site. And one of the kind of iconic elements of the site that emerged early in the discussion were the footprints, the so-called footprints of the two towers, two 200-foot squares from which the towers had risen. What's ironic, of course, is that after the site was cleared, these sacred spaces no longer existed. So, in effect, the memorial is a reconstruction of the outline of the footprints of the towers as two voided spaces, two holes in the ground, in effect. I'm not exactly sure where the design is precisely, but people are meant to descend into memorial chambers. The names of the victims will be inscribed. There was a big debate about whether they would be inscribed at the lowest level of the memorial. They will not be in the current scheme, rather will be around the rim at grade. But they're still, the way in which the victims are enumerated is still an object of great controversy, and survivor groups are perplexed. The uniformed rescuers have their position about being identified by unit and rank and separately from the other victims. So this is I think a compromise is on the table at this point. But again, these matters, which seem to be of relatively small import, assume incredible importance in the hearts and minds of people who were affected by this event.
Now, when you talk about the footprints of the two towers,
yeah.
So actually, where the towers were, there's not going to be anything constructed because those were large spaces. How do you have footprints if you're going to actually reconstruct
what there
buildings on the site?
Well, essentially the site is going to be divided. So if you imagine a kind of an L shape, there will be buildings in an L shape, and in the remainder of the site will be the memorial. The original World Trade Center had a series of low ancillary buildings at the perimeter of the site. And in effect, what's happening is that where there were tall buildings, there will now be memorial, and where there were low buildings, there will now be tall buildings. It's a kind of flip.
So in the last, who had the last word on this as we are now? Finally, who okayed the final plan?
Well, the powers here, of course. The outgoing governor, George Pataki, now running for president, was extremely concerned that the so-called Freedom Tower be under construction before he left office. So in some technical sense, it is. So there was a strong pressure from him. The mayor intervened very late in the game, although I can't say exactly what he was doing behind the scenes, in order to force the obstinate leaseholder to sign on to the final deal, which he did under pressure. Of course, legally, the final say rests with the Port Authority, who owns the land.
Right.
But as I say, after all this maneuvering, what will happen on the site is that 10 million square feet of office space will return. Right. Yeah. A giant shopping mall will return. Right. And the memorial. Yeah. It's still unclear what cultural institutions will be present on the site. A lot of people thought very early on that it was important that the arts be represented, both in order to say something about freedom of expression and also to serve the Lower Manhattan area, which is somewhat bereft of artistic facilities. And that has been controversial. Two institutions that were initially chosen to be on the site, a gallery called the Drawing Center, a fine, respected gallery, and something called the International Freedom Museum, were both initially thought to be part of the project, but then people got nervous that they would express themselves too freely, and that there was a danger that some un-American art or some kind of a study of equivalences would take place in the Freedom Center, and they were scotched. Now it's not quite clear what cultural facilities will be on the site. something.
And where does Giuliani fit into all this? After all, he's about to declare, for the presidency. And as you were saying, I didn't realize Pataki's also apparently. Do you say he's going to declare run for president?
Kamikaze. Yeah, no, he apparently
he is.
It's made it known that he has ambitions. I can't imagine he has a prayer of getting the nomination.
What about Giuliani? Where did you mentioned at the beginning you and he were on the same page with this? Did you admit?
I would say that in the history of the Giuliani administration, the one thing on which we could be said to have been on the same page was this idea that the site should be left alone, should be a public space.
Right.
He came out for that early, but somehow has dropped out of the.
He dropped out of that, and then what about Bloomberg, the mayor? I mean, what happened with him, his leadership?
He was relatively quiescent in the early stages. He entered the scene. Bloomberg is a billionaire, shrewd businessman, and when the deal was getting preposterous and seemed in danger of unraveling, and someone had to read the riot act to this developer, I think Bloomberg stepped up to the plate and sort of squeezed these guys in order to get the deal done.
Tell us about what lessons we can learn from this. Clearly, there are going to be other, it's unfortunate, but there'll be other incidents where we'll want to memorialize sites. Tell me what we can learn from this, and do you see that there can be any government action that would make the process more democratic in the future?
Well, one of the singular things about this particular site is that the normal instruments of democratic governance were absent on the site. The kinds of environmental and community reviews that are built into the structure of the planning laws in New York City were not observed precisely because the site was in the ownership of this special authority. There were proposals early on that the city swap the land under the airports for the Ground Zero site in order to regain control of the site. This was a little bit of a negotiation, but it didn't go too far. I certainly think that this might have been an occasion for the federal government to have stepped in and declared this, by its powers of eminent domain, to be a national memorial, like Gettysburg.
Absolutely.
So
very strange that they didn't get involved in it.
Well, yes and no.
They get involved in everything else these days.
Well, or not.
That's true.
But they are a business-friendly administration.
That's true.
So, in terms of the sanctity of private property, it's understandable why they took a relatively hands-off approach.
So, but as I say, are there lessons to be learned from this? Are we going to be moved into a brighter future as a result of this? Is there legislation coming out of this? Are New Yorkers riled enough to?
Well, we'll see. I mean, everybody's a little bit numb, and this has been going on for 5 years. Yeah. I was on yet another panel discussion last night talking about this, and the mood was glum because the deal is done, and I'm afraid that the lessons that will be learned are going to be negative object lessons.
Power and money wins.
Yeah, when this stuff gets built, it's not going to be an intensely inviting public space. Well,
you're an expert on this subject of memorializing and architecture that memorializes, and I know that you've been tough on New York City. Yeah. Tell me about other examples of architecture that memorializes that you feel has been democratic and also somehow true to the pain of the experience that is being memorialized.
Well, I think the most exemplary recent memorial is the Vietnam Memorial. There was I just picked up the Wall Street Journal in the airport. Didn't spend money for it. And there was a survey of the top 200 buildings in the United States, a popular survey, not a survey of architects. I think the one that everybody was outraged by was the people adore the Bellagio Hotel, but one of the few modern buildings that there was a heartfelt and strong response to was the Vietnam Memorial, because it, I think, very succinctly comes to terms with something that is rather ambiguous. The war in Vietnam, a war that we lost, a tragedy, not a victory. And in its sobriety and simplicity, and in its commemoration of each individual American who was lost, I think it's a very strong and evocative piece of work. The descent below grade, the confrontation with the names, the reflectivity of the surface, and the simplicity of the memorial, I think, is very eloquent.
Well, that raises a question now, because when was the Vietnam Memorial finished?
God, when was the Vietnam Memorial
It's fairly
finished?
recent,
Yeah.
isn't it? So I mean, it's a long time since the war.
In the 80s.
Yeah, but I'm wondering, was it the 80s? I'm just wondering if how long a gap there has to be between the trauma of the event and what's memorializing it to get distance on it. Because I'm thinking, here are these people. Well, obviously, some of it's money. You say, you want to have another big building on there because you put business. But the other thing is, I think, don't you think, those SOBs, we want to put back something that was there. There's a sort of triumphalist. It's not a very reflective response.
It is not a very reflective response. I have to say, at the end of the day, I think that the memorial will be eloquent. Will be reasonably succinct and moving. I mean, there are difficulties in the setting. There may be too much traffic nearby, but it is in a way, it was a kind of predetermined that the memorial would be more or less like it is. The power of the idea of these voided footprints was so strong that I imagine half the competitors had some riff on the footprints.
Right.
So in the sense that there was a shared feeling about the appropriateness of evoking those symbols, I think that the memorial is going to be okay. The worry is it'll be slightly overwrought. Nobody knows exactly what artifacts are going to be in it. But as a simple declaration of memorialization, I think it's going to be fine. The problem with that site is, of course, everything else that's on the site, which is this rampant commercialism and these giant office buildings, which seem to me interrupt the aura of the sacred memory.
You want to talk about any other spaces that you find particularly effective, that is memorialized, spaces that memorialize events? I mean, there's the Alfred Murrah building in Oklahoma.
Yeah.
Arizona battleship, Pearl Harbor. Are you interested in these?
Well, there's an elaborate discourse of memorials.
Yeah.
And clearly, we're talking about things that memorialize violent events, which is a special category of memory. The fine memorials of Washington to Lincoln and Jefferson, in what used to be the standard discourse for memorialization and classical architecture, are elegant and beautiful and stately, and feel right in Washington, and as does the obelisk to our first president. So these stately memorials, they feel fine. The Vietnam Memorial is interesting because it sets up its geometry in relationship to the other memorials. So one of its accomplishments is that it pays attention not simply to the character of the event that it commemorates, but to its own immediate context, and fits into the fabric of this great mall of memorials. Others are less successful. For example, although more time passed between the event and the construction of the World War II memorial, it fits very badly in its context. It interrupts the progression of
this
the
is the one that was recently, fairly recently
relatively
competed.
recently finished.
You don't like it?
No, I don't like it. It seems clumsy and overwrought to me. Lacks the simplicity and elegance of the Vietnam Memorial.
European memorials. Do we face a different culture in this country of memorials? I mean, I don't know whether you have the same conflict between the capitalism and trying to memorialize in a sense without the burden of having to negotiate with market forces and so on.
I don't think that the issue with the memorial itself, I don't think, is the outcome of its having to negotiate with market forces.
I see.
Plenty of money was made available for that memorial. But I think it would be a mistake to think that there is a single strategy for memorialization. Memorials, like any other architecture or landscape, should be the objects of creativity and imagination. So I don't think that there is a definitive notion of how we remember things. We're going to be confronted at some point with memorializing the tragedy that's going on even today in Iraq. I don't know where we will do that. I know that it is unlikely that we will memorialize our own victims. That we will surely remember the 5,000 Americans who will have died in Iraq and Afghanistan, but the hundreds of thousands of Iraqis will go nameless and uncommemorated, certainly by us. So this is a fraught subject. One of the classics of memorial architecture is the work of Edward Lutyens in the Memorials to the First World War, in which the simple cenotaphs which mark the fields, the endless fields of identical simple headstones like Arlington. This is gut-wrenching stuff. In the same way, if you've visited the remains of a concentration camp, these are places in which architectural interventions must be kept to a minimum because of the overwhelming weight of meaning that the site itself bears. In the same sense, I think that one runs the risk always of doing too much by way of commemoration.
Well, unfortunately, we're out of time. Not that we've done too much. I think it's just right. Thank you very much for being with us.
My pleasure.
Appreciate it. We've been speaking with Michael Sorkin, the 2006-07 O'Fallon Lecturer in Art and American Culture. Thank you for watching.